Don't let him take those pills, Ava Williams shouted, her voice cutting through the crystal chandelier silence of the Manhattan Gala like a siren nobody expected, and for half a second the entire room seemed to forget how to breathe. The music still playing softly from a string quartet in the corner, but suddenly feeling distant, unreal, as every head turned toward the small black girl standing near the grand entrance doors, her hands trembling, her eyes locked on the man at the center of the room, billionaire Jonathan Pierce, who was holding a small glass of water and a neatly sealed prescription bottle on the table in front of him. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration inside the top-floor ballroom of the Sterling Grand Hotel overlooking Central Park, where New York City lights shimmered like scattered diamonds. Jonathan Pierce, founder and CEO of Pierce Holdings, stood surrounded by investors, board members, and media photographers, his presence calm but commanding in a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Beside him stood Victoria Hale, elegant, composed, smiling with practiced warmth, her hand resting lightly on his arm like she belonged there more than anyone else in the room. And for a moment after Ava's words there was only silence. Then a ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through the guests as people assumed it was just a child being dramatic. Security began to move in, but Jonathan raised a hand, stopping them, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at Ava, not with anger, but with something closer to curiosity. Ava Williams, 7 years old, hair neatly braided, wearing a simple navy dress and white sneakers that contrasted sharply with the polished marble floor beneath her feet. She looked small in a room built for giants. But she did not move back. She took one step forward instead, her voice shaking but steady as she repeated, "Don't let him take those pills." Victoria smiled gently, the kind of smile that looked comforting from a distance but carried something colder underneath when seen up close. "Oh, sweetheart," she said softly, "I think you're confused. These are just supplements, nothing dangerous, but—" Ava shook her head quickly, her eyes glistening. "No. I saw you. I saw you in the pharmacy room this morning. You touched the bottle. You switched something." The words landed like a stone in water, creating ripples that spread through the crowd. Jonathan's expression changed slightly, the humor fading from his face as he glanced between Ava and Victoria. The room's energy shifted. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses stopped halfway to lips, and even the cameras seemed to hesitate. Victoria let out a small, controlled laugh, turning slightly toward the guests as if performing. "This is what happens when children misunderstand adult spaces. It's harmless imagination. Jonathan, you can't possibly." But Jonathan didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained on Ava, and something in her expression made him pause. She wasn't performing. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't seeking attention. She looked afraid, but certain, and that difference mattered more than anything else in the room. Jonathan slowly placed the glass down on the table, the sound of crystal against wood sharper than expected in the silence. "Ava," he said quietly, "what exactly did you see?" Ava swallowed hard, her small hands clenched at her sides. "I saw her in the medical suite earlier today. She was alone. She opened the cabinet. She took your prescription bottle. She changed the labels. I didn't understand at first, but I remembered the color of the caps from when the nurse showed me yesterday." A low murmur spread through the guests, uncertainty replacing amusement. Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Jonathan noticed, just for a second, the way her fingers adjusted the bracelet on her wrist, a small repetitive motion he had seen before when she was stressed, or lying, or both. He wasn't sure which. Security hesitated near the entrance waiting for instruction, but Jonathan lifted his hand again, not looking away from Ava. "Show me," he said simply, and the words shifted everything again. Ava quickly pulled out a small tablet from her bag, her fingers shaking as she tapped the screen. A video appeared, slightly grainy, showing a hallway outside the private medical room earlier that day, a figure resembling Victoria entering, glancing around, then moving quickly toward a cabinet before placing something inside her purse. The room erupted in whispers. Victoria's composure cracked for the first time. Jonathan stepped closer to the screen, his jaw tightening as he replayed the clip, the gala behind them fading into background noise as reality narrowed into something sharp and uncomfortable. Victoria exhaled slowly, her voice soft but now edged with tension. "Jonathan, you don't seriously believe a child's edited video over me?" over everything we've built. Do you? But Jonathan didn't answer, because for the first time he noticed something else, the pill bottle on the table, the label slightly misaligned, the seal not exactly the way it should be, and Ava, still standing in the same spot, was watching him not with expectation, but with quiet certainty, as if she already knew this moment would come. And somewhere between the laughter that had died and the silence that now replaced it, Jonathan Pierce realized that tonight was no longer about celebration. It was about truth waiting to surface in a room full of people who had not yet decided whether they wanted to see it or not. The silence in the ballroom did not last long, because silence in a room full of powerful people rarely does. It quickly turned into overlapping whispers, cautious glances, and the kind of uneasy laughter people use when they are not sure what side of reality they are standing on. Victoria Hale took a slow step forward, releasing Jonathan Pierce's arm as if distancing herself from the situation without actually moving away. Her expression now carefully rebuilt into something calm and sympathetic, like a mask placed back over a crack that almost showed too much. Jonathan still stood near the table where the pill bottle rested, his attention divided between the small tablet in Ava Williams's hands and Victoria's composed face. Ava remained exactly where she had been since speaking, her feet planted firmly on the marble floor that reflected the golden glow of chandeliers above. She looked even smaller, now under the attention of dozens of adults turning their focus toward her. Some guests were already shaking their heads slightly, murmuring that children at events like this often misunderstood things they overheard. Others were watching Jonathan instead, trying to read which direction his judgment would fall. Victoria let out a soft breath and stepped closer to the center of the room, her heels clicking lightly, the sound deliberate, controlled. She placed a hand over her chest and addressed the room rather than Ava directly, her voice gentle enough to sound reasonable but firm enough to suggest authority. She said that what was happening was unfortunate, that stress and imagination could sometimes create confusion in young minds, especially in environments they did not fully understand. A few people nodded faintly at her words, as if relieved to have a simpler explanation available. Jonathan's eyes shifted between Victoria and Ava again, his jaw tightening slightly, not with anger yet, but with something more complicated, uncertainty building where confidence usually lived. Ava noticed the shift in the room. She saw how quickly adults could begin to turn away from what they did not want to believe, and yet she did not step back. Instead, she lifted the tablet again with both hands and said quietly but clearly that she had not edited anything, that she had only recorded what she saw because something about it felt wrong. Her voice was not loud, but it carried in the sudden quiet that followed Victoria's speech. Jonathan exhaled slowly, then took one step forward, closing the distance between himself and the child, not aggressively, but with intent, like a man trying to separate noise from truth. He asked Ava to show him the recording again, and as she played it, the room collectively leaned into the screen. The grainy hallway footage appeared once more, the sterile corridor outside the private medical suite, Victoria's figure moving with purpose, checking the surroundings before interacting with the cabinet. The image was not perfect, but it was clear enough to create discomfort in the atmosphere. Victoria immediately responded with a soft laugh that sounded slightly forced this time. She turned toward Jonathan directly, her eyes searching his face. She said that in any large building like this, there were always multiple staff members with access, that it was irresponsible to draw conclusions from a single unclear clip, and that she was disappointed he would even consider such an accusation without speaking to her privately first. Jonathan did not answer immediately. His gaze stayed on the screen for a few seconds longer before shifting back to the pill bottle on the table. He picked it up slowly, examining the label, the seal, the small details that most people would ignore, but he never did. Ava's voice broke the moment of inspection when she quietly added that she remembered the timestamp because she had been waiting outside the medical suite for her own appointment check-in and had been watching the hallway clock. A detail so simple it did not feel rehearsed, it just felt observed. A few guests exchanged glances again, the mood in the room beginning to fracture into uncertainty rather than disbelief. Victoria noticed it too, her posture adjusting slightly, her tone becoming more controlled. She suggested again that Jonathan allow the professionals to handle this, that involving a child in corporate misunderstandings was unnecessary and potentially harmful. But Jonathan raised one hand, not sharply, but enough to stop the flow of her words. His eyes remained fixed on Ava for a long moment, studying her expression, not searching for drama, but for consistency, for something that did not shift under pressure. Ava held his gaze without wavering, though her fingers tightened slightly around the tablet. Victoria took advantage of the pause, stepping closer again, lowering her voice now, so it felt more personal, almost intimate. She said, "Jonathan, you know me. You know what we are building together. You cannot let a moment like this, a misunderstanding, define something so much larger." But Jonathan did not respond to her immediately. Instead, he looked back down at the pill bottle in his hand, turning it slightly under the chandelier light. And for the first time since the evening began, the confidence that usually defined him seemed to hesitate, not vanish, but pause, as if waiting for something else to confirm itself. The entire room seemed to hold its breath again, not because of what was said, but because of what had not yet been decided. And in that suspended moment, Ava simply stood still, watching the only adult in the room who had not yet fully chosen what to believe. Jonathan Pierce held the pill bottle slightly higher now, rotating it under the chandelier light as if the answer he was looking for might be hidden beneath the printed label or inside the seal itself. The ballroom felt different now, not louder or quieter, but heavier, like the air had gained weight in the seconds since Ava Williams showed the recording. Victoria Hale noticed the shift too and adjusted her expression again, smoothing it into something calm but more distant, as if she was now observing Jonathan from a careful emotional step back rather than standing beside him. Ava remained still, her tablet lowered slightly but still in her hands, her eyes moving between Jonathan and Victoria with a focus that did not belong to a child trying to win an argument, but to someone who had already seen something they could not forget. Jonathan finally lowered the bottle back onto the table and looked directly at Ava again, his voice quieter than before, asking her to explain exactly what she saw, not in fragments, not in impressions, but in sequence. Ava took a small breath and nodded, then described the morning in the private medical wing on the 32nd floor of Pierce Holdings headquarters. She said she had been waiting outside the consultation room because her appointment for a basic wellness check had been delayed. She mentioned the hallway clock showing 10:43 in the morning and how she remembered it because she had been practicing reading time on analog clocks with a nurse earlier that week. She said she saw Victoria enter the restricted medical storage area alone, carrying nothing at first, then leaving with her purse noticeably heavier. Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly at the detail of the timing, not because it proved anything yet, but because it was specific in a way most children did not fabricate under pressure. Victoria gave a soft, controlled laugh again, stepping closer with measured confidence, and said that the medical wing had multiple staff rotations, that doors opened and closed constantly, and that it was impossible for a child to know what she thought she saw without misunderstanding context. Her voice was smooth, almost reassuring again, but there was a faint edge underneath it now, like patience being carefully maintained rather than naturally felt. Jonathan turned slightly toward her, but did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, the movement subtle but decisive. He unlocked it and tapped once, then looked at Ava, asking her if she was certain about the hallway number. Ava nodded immediately and said corridor B7 near the West Wing elevators, the exact same place where the pharmaceutical storage unit was located. A few guests shifted uncomfortably now, no longer confident enough to whisper jokes or dismiss the situation entirely. Jonathan's assistant, who had been standing near the edge of the room, quietly stepped forward as if anticipating instruction, but Jonathan did not give it yet. Instead, he replayed the security feed on his phone, his expression tightening as he compared what he saw with what Ava had described. Victoria's gaze followed the screen, and for the first time she stopped speaking completely. Jonathan asked Ava one more question, not loudly, but clearly, asking if anyone else was present when she saw Victoria. Ava paused for a fraction of a second, then said no. Only her and a nurse who had briefly walked past the end of the corridor without stopping. That detail made Jonathan look down again at the pill bottle, his thumb brushing lightly over the seal. Then he set the bottle aside as if it no longer belonged in his immediate focus. The entire room seemed to wait for him to speak. But instead, he turned and walked a few steps toward the side console where the building control panel and internal communications system were embedded. He spoke quietly into his phone, asking for a full audit of medical wing access logs for the last 24 hours. No exceptions, no filters. Victoria's expression changed slightly at that moment, not into panic, but into something more controlled and calculating. She stepped forward and said, "Jonathan, this is unnecessary. You are allowing a child's interpretation to override professional protocol. This could damage reputations without reason." But Jonathan raised his hand again, not looking at her this time. His attention still on the device in his hand as data began to populate the screen. Ava stood in the same place, her shoulders tense but steady, watching Jonathan rather than Victoria now. Because something in his silence had changed, it was no longer the silence of doubt. It was the silence of processing, of comparing, of waiting for confirmation that had not yet arrived, but was already beginning to form. A technician voice came through the phone speaker, confirming that there had been an unscheduled access event in the medical storage corridor at exactly 10:42 that morning, authorized under Victoria Hale's temporary clearance code. The words were simple, but in the ballroom they landed like something far heavier. Victoria's face did not immediately change, but her eyes did, just slightly, as if recalculating every possible direction the moment could still go. Jonathan did not look at her yet. He simply closed his phone slowly, placed it on the table beside the pill bottle, and exhaled once, long and controlled. And when he finally turned back toward Victoria, the room around them felt like it had shifted into a different kind of silence, one where no one was certain what would happen next. But everyone understood that nothing would remain the same after this moment, and Ava, still standing exactly where she had been since the beginning, finally lowered her tablet, not because she was told to, but because she no longer needed to prove anything else. The ballroom felt different now, not because anything new had been added, but because something essential had been removed. The illusion that had held the room together only minutes earlier had begun to collapse in layers, and Jonathan Pierce stood at the center of it all with a stillness that made the surrounding movement feel uncertain, his eyes fixed on Victoria Hale as if trying to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the information that had just been confirmed through the internal system audit. Ava Williams stood slightly behind him now, quieter than before, her small hands resting at her sides, no longer holding the tablet, no longer needing to prove anything, because the truth had already begun to speak for itself through the silence of adults who were no longer confident in what they were witnessing. Victoria exhaled slowly and stepped forward again, but this time the rhythm of her movement was different, less graceful, more deliberate, as if she was trying to regain control of a space that had already started to slip away from her influence. She looked directly at Jonathan and spoke first, her voice carefully measured, saying that the system logs did not represent context, that authorized access was part of her responsibilities, that she had entered the medical wing to verify compliance procedures regarding the prescription batch, and that any interpretation beyond that was speculation fueled by a child's misunderstanding. She gestured slightly toward Ava as she said the word child, not aggressively, but enough to reposition the narrative in the room. Several guests shifted again, unsure, caught between authority and evidence. Jonathan did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Ava, and his voice when he finally spoke was calm, but no longer distant. He asked her to repeat exactly what she had seen after Victoria entered the storage area. Ava hesitated only briefly, then said she saw Victoria open the lower cabinet, remove a sealed container, check the labels, and place something back that did not look like what she had taken out. She said she remembered it because the color strip on the bottle had been blue originally and appeared red when it came back onto the shelf. Jonathan absorbed the detail without interruption, his expression tightening slightly, not in anger, but in focus, like someone assembling pieces of a structure that no longer aligned the way it should. Victoria immediately responded, saying that color coding systems in medical facilities were standardized and that children often misinterpreted lighting and reflection in sterile environments. Her tone was now more controlled, but the softness she had used earlier had started to fade, replaced with something more procedural, more defensive. Jonathan finally turned fully toward her, the distance between them now feeling less like physical space and more like a defined boundary. He asked her directly why her clearance code had been used in a restricted pharmaceutical audit window without prior notification to the internal compliance team. Victoria paused for a fraction of a second longer than before, then replied that she had been acting under urgent advisory discretion due to a scheduling conflict with senior medical staff, and that she had already documented the reason in the internal notes. Jonathan's gaze did not move, and when he spoke again his voice remained controlled but carried a weight that made nearby conversations fade completely. He asked to see those notes. The room collectively seemed to lean into the exchange without moving. Phones lowered, glasses untouched. Even the faint music from the string quartet felt distant now. Victoria hesitated, then said the documentation would be available through formal request channels and that this was not the appropriate moment for procedural interrogation in a public setting. Jonathan nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the structure of her answer, but then he looked down at the pill bottle again, the object that had started all of this, and said quietly that the label mismatch was not consistent with standard storage rotation protocols. Ava, still watching, noticed something in Jonathan's posture change, not dramatically, but enough to feel like a shift in alignment, as if he was no longer trying to decide who to believe, but instead trying to determine what system had allowed this situation to occur. Victoria stepped closer again, lowering her voice, trying a different angle. She said, "Jonathan, you are letting external interpretation override internal trust structures. This is not how we operate. You know me. You know my work. You know what I have built with you." But Jonathan finally raised his hand slightly, not to silence her aggressively, but to interrupt the emotional direction of her words. He said her name once, calmly, and asked her to step back from the table. The request was simple, but in the context of the room it landed heavily. Victoria's expression tightened, and for the first time there was a visible fracture in her composure. Ava looked between them without speaking, her presence now quieter than before, but more significant, because she was no longer the source of the claim. She had become the reference point for everything being measured against. Jonathan turned slightly toward Ava and asked one final question, not about evidence, but about certainty, asking her if she was absolutely sure about what she had seen. Ava nodded without hesitation, and in that moment the room seemed to narrow around that single confirmation. Victoria exhaled sharply, a sound that carried both restraint and frustration, and said that it was irresponsible to allow certainty to be formed from incomplete perception. But Jonathan did not respond to her this time. Instead, he looked at the surrounding guests, then back at Victoria, and said calmly that internal compliance review had already been initiated based on the audit logs, and that all access activity would be verified independently. The words were not accusatory. They were procedural, but they changed the atmosphere completely, because they meant the situation was no longer conversational, it was now structural. And Victoria, standing under the chandelier light that once framed her as composed and in control, realized that the room was no longer listening to tone. It was listening to data, and Ava Williams, still standing quietly beside Jonathan Pierce, understood without needing anyone to explain that something irreversible had already begun to unfold. The atmosphere inside the Sterling Grand Hotel ballroom had shifted into something irreversible, not louder, not calmer, but structurally different, as if the space itself had stopped participating in the illusion of celebration and was now functioning as a witness to something far more serious. Jonathan Pierce stood slightly away from the center table, where the pill bottle and phone still rested, his attention divided but increasingly focused, not on the crowd anymore, not even on Victoria Hale's carefully controlled presence, but on the sequence of confirmations that were now stacking in his mind like evidence that refused to collapse under interpretation. Ava Williams remained close to him, but not touching, her small figure steady in a way that contrasted sharply with the instability spreading through the adults around her. Victoria had stopped advancing, but she had not retreated either. Instead, she stood in a position that suggested calculation rather than surrender, her eyes moving between Jonathan and the internal team that had begun quietly forming near the edge of the ballroom. Jonathan's executive assistant approached him carefully and leaned in just enough to speak without broadcasting, confirming that the compliance verification team had been dispatched and that full access logs from the medical wing were now being cross-referenced with biometric entry data. Jonathan nodded once, not taking his eyes off the center of the room for long. Ava looked up at him briefly and then back toward Victoria, as if trying to understand not just what was happening, but what came next when adults stopped agreeing on reality. Victoria finally broke her silence again, her tone shifting into something more formal. She stated clearly that she would cooperate fully with any internal review, but insisted that her access had been properly authorized under emergency medical protocol. She emphasized her long-standing position within Pierce Holdings and reminded Jonathan that she had overseen multiple regulatory audits without issue. Her words were structured, intentional, designed to re-establish stability through credibility, but the emotional temperature in the room no longer responded to credibility alone. Jonathan raised his hand slightly and asked her to remain where she was while the verification process completed. The request was calm, but absolute, and for the first time Victoria's composure showed a visible strain. Ava noticed it in the way Victoria's eyes briefly flicked toward the exit route before returning to Jonathan, a subtle calculation that no one else seemed to catch, or perhaps no one else wanted to interpret. The ballroom guests had now fully shifted into silence, no longer pretending this was a misunderstanding, instead watching a process unfold that none of them controlled. Jonathan's phone vibrated softly, and he glanced at it, reading a short update from the compliance lead confirming that discrepancies had been found in the medication handling chain of custody, not yet conclusive, but inconsistent enough to require escalation. He closed the message without reacting outwardly, then looked directly at Victoria and asked her to explain one more time why her access log showed entry into the restricted storage corridor at 10:42 in the morning without accompanying witness confirmation. Victoria's response came after a brief pause, longer than any of her previous ones. She repeated that she had acted within scope, but her tone had shifted slightly, less fluid, more precise, as if every word was now being weighed before release. Ava stepped half a step closer to Jonathan without realizing it, her attention fixed on Victoria's face. Jonathan noticed the movement, but did not comment on it. Instead, he turned slightly toward Ava and asked quietly if she remembered anything else about what she saw in the corridor. Ava hesitated, then said she remembered Victoria checking her phone immediately after leaving the storage room, as if confirming something. That detail changed the rhythm in Jonathan's expression, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that the pattern was forming into something recognizable. Victoria immediately responded, saying that checking her phone was standard procedure for coordinating medical logistics, and that selective memory from a child should not be treated as forensic testimony. Her voice was firmer now, but there was a thin edge of urgency underneath it that had not been present earlier. Jonathan did not engage with the argument. Instead, he turned his attention back to the compliance update that had just arrived. The audit system had flagged a secondary inconsistency. A temporary override token had been used to bypass a standard dual verification checkpoint during the same time window. The room did not hear the message, but Jonathan's silence after reading it was enough for those closest to him to sense a shift. He placed the phone down gently and looked at Victoria for a long moment without speaking. And in that silence, Victoria seemed to understand that the conversation was no longer about interpretation. Ava watched both of them carefully, her small hands now loosely clasped in front of her, no longer trembling, but still alert, as if she knew that adults in moments like this could change direction without warning. Jonathan finally spoke again, his voice steady but no longer uncertain. He said that all access activity in the medical wing during that time frame was now under full forensic audit, including device logs, corridor surveillance, and chemical inventory reconciliation. He did not raise his voice, but the clarity of the statement made it final in a way that required no emphasis. Victoria exhaled slowly, then responded that she would wait for the full report before further discussion. But her posture had changed slightly, no longer fully aligned with the center of the room, instead angled subtly toward the side exit. Ava noticed it again, and this time she looked up at Jonathan as if silently confirming that he saw it too. Jonathan did, but he did not react outwardly. Instead, he simply shifted his stance slightly, positioning himself between Victoria and the nearest exit path, not aggressively, not dramatically, but unmistakably. In the ballroom, now completely quiet except for the faint sound of city traffic far below the hotel windows, seemed to understand without being told that whatever came next would not remain contained within assumptions or explanations. Because the system had already begun speaking louder than anyone in the room, the moment Jonathan Pierce shifted his stance between Victoria Hale and the nearest exit path, the energy in the ballroom changed again, not in volume, but in direction, as if the room itself had begun to align around a single, unfolding point rather than multiple competing interpretations. Ava Williams noticed it first in the way the adults stopped adjusting their posture for each other and started adjusting for the space itself, as if anticipating movement that had not yet happened. Jonathan stood still, but his stillness now had structure, not hesitation, and Victoria noticed it too, her eyes narrowing slightly as she registered that the room was no longer responding to her presence in the way it had earlier in the evening. The subtle advantage she had maintained through composure and authority was no longer effective in the same way. Jonathan's executive assistant stepped closer and quietly confirmed that the compliance team had initiated full cross-verification, including corridor surveillance synchronization with biometric entry logs and pharmaceutical inventory reconciliation, and that preliminary alignment between systems was now in progress. Jonathan gave a slight nod, then looked toward Ava, who had not moved from her position but was now watching him more than Victoria, as if waiting for the next structural decision rather than the next emotional reaction. Victoria finally broke the silence with a controlled inhale, then stated that she would like the opportunity to clarify the procedural nature of her access one more time before any further assumptions were made public or internal. Her tone was carefully neutral, but there was now a visible shift in cadence, less fluid confidence and more measured containment. Jonathan did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward the side wall where a discrete monitoring panel had been activated by the compliance team, a soft indicator, light pulsing as new data streams arrived. Ava followed his gaze and saw the faint reflection of moving numbers and timestamps. Though she could not interpret them, she understood enough to know they represented something irreversible in motion. Victoria took a step forward again, but stopped when Jonathan raised his hand slightly, not as interruption this time, but as confirmation that she should remain where she was. He then spoke calmly, stating that the medical wing surveillance feed from Corridor B7 had been fully recovered from backup redundancy storage and was now being synchronized with access logs. The words were delivered without emotion, but they caused a visible change in Victoria's expression for the first time. Not panic, not anger, but a tightening that suggested anticipation of confirmation she no longer controlled. Ava shifted her weight slightly, her eyes moving between Jonathan and Victoria, sensing that the balance in the room had fully transitioned away from argument and into verification. A few guests in the background began to quietly reposition themselves, no longer facing the center casually, but instead watching as if the room had become a live audit rather than a social event. Jonathan's phone vibrated again, and this time he did not look at it immediately. Instead, he waited, as if already expecting what it would contain. When he finally glanced down, his expression did not change dramatically, but his eyes sharpened slightly. The compliance lead had confirmed a full visual match between corridor footage and access logs, including a time-stamped entry showing Victoria Hale entering the restricted pharmaceutical storage corridor alone and exiting within a 3-minute window, carrying an unregistered secondary container not listed in inventory records. The detail was clinical, precise, and without interpretation. Jonathan lowered the phone slowly and placed it face down on the table, the sound of contact with polished wood echoing faintly in the silence. Victoria immediately responded, her voice now more direct, stating that the footage required contextual review and that isolated visual confirmation did not establish intent or misconduct. But her phrasing had changed subtly, no longer emphasizing collaboration or shared process, but instead shifting toward defense and limitation. Jonathan finally turned to face her fully, and when he spoke, his voice remained controlled but carried a finality that had not been present earlier. He stated that internal compliance protocols did not determine intent at this stage, only sequence integrity and system consistency, and that both conditions had now been verified as inconsistent with her declared account. Ava listened without moving, her small face steady but attentive, as if absorbing not just the outcome but the structure of how truth was being assembled around her presence. Victoria paused for a moment longer than before, then said that she would be consulting legal and regulatory counsel before responding further to internal escalation procedures. Her voice was now fully procedural, no longer conversational. Jonathan nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without engaging with it, and then looked past her toward the compliance team member who had entered the ballroom quietly from the side corridor, carrying a tablet displaying synchronized audit results. The team member approached and stopped near Jonathan, confirming in a low voice that all systems had now converged on a single verified timeline, including biometric entry, corridor surveillance, and chemical inventory logs, all of which aligned with Ava Williams's initial report in terms of sequence accuracy. The mention of Ava's name caused several heads in the room to turn slightly toward her, as if recognizing that the smallest person present had become the reference point for the entire verification process. Jonathan looked down at Ava for a brief moment, not with surprise, but with a kind of measured recognition. Then he turned back toward Victoria, who was now standing still without speaking, her posture unchanged but her authority no longer projecting into the room with the same effect. Jonathan stated calmly that access privileges for the medical wing had been temporarily suspended pending full regulatory review, and that all personnel involved in the chain of custody would remain under active audit status until resolution. The announcement did not carry emotional weight, but it carried operational consequence, and that was enough to shift the entire room into a different understanding of what they were witnessing. Ava exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering slightly for the first time since the beginning of the evening, not in relief exactly, but in the quiet recognition that what she had seen had been acknowledged as real. Victoria remained silent now, her eyes moving briefly across the room before settling back on Jonathan. And in that moment it became clear that the evening was no longer about disagreement or interpretation, but about the irreversible activation of systems that once triggered no longer waited for permission to conclude. The ballroom no longer felt like a celebration space, but like a suspended decision point where every movement had consequence, every silence carried meaning, and every gaze was part of an unfolding system of judgment that no longer required interpretation from the people inside it. Jonathan Pierce stood at the center of this shifting equilibrium with a stillness that was no longer uncertainty, but resolution forming in real time. As the compliance team member beside him lowered their tablet slightly and confirmed once more that the synchronized audit results had reached full convergence across all systems, corridor surveillance, biometric entry logs, pharmaceutical inventory tracking, and internal authorization records all aligned into a single uninterrupted sequence that contradicted the explanation previously provided by Victoria Hale. Ava Williams stood a few steps behind Jonathan now, her posture relaxed in a way it had not been since the beginning of the evening, not because the situation had become easy, but because the burden of proving what she had seen was no longer hers to carry. Victoria remained in place near the center of the ballroom floor, her composure still present, but no longer performing the same function as before. It no longer shaped the room, it only existed within it. Jonathan finally spoke again, his voice steady and calm, stating that the internal audit had completed its initial validation phase, and that all recorded data confirmed an unauthorized alteration of pharmaceutical inventory during the exact access window registered under Victoria Hale's credentials. The words were not delivered with emotion, but with administrative clarity that removed ambiguity from the room entirely. A faint sound of shifting movement passed through the guests, not conversation, but repositioning, as if everyone collectively understood that the moment of interpretation had ended and the moment of consequence had begun. Victoria exhaled slowly and raised her chin slightly, responding that she would not engage with preliminary conclusions drawn from system correlation alone, and that she would await formal external review before acknowledging any implication of wrongdoing. Her tone was controlled, but it no longer carried the same influence it had earlier in the evening. Jonathan did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked briefly toward Ava, who met his gaze without hesitation, and in that brief exchange there was no longer any question about whether her statement had been accurate, only acknowledgement that it had been verified. Jonathan turned back toward Victoria and stated that effective immediately her access privileges within Pierce Holdings' Medical Oversight Division were suspended pending full regulatory investigation, and that all associated responsibilities would be reassigned to interim compliance leadership. The announcement was delivered without escalation in volume, yet it moved through the room with unmistakable finality. Victoria's expression shifted for the first time into something less controlled, not collapse, but recognition that the structure supporting her position had already been withdrawn. She glanced briefly around the room, as if assessing whether any procedural support or informal alliance remained available, but found none that responded. Jonathan's executive assistant stepped forward and confirmed quietly that security protocols had been updated and that access to restricted floors and systems had been revoked in real time. Ava watched this exchange closely, her attention steady, not fearful, but absorbing the reality of how quickly authority could be reassigned when systems no longer supported it. Victoria took a small step backward, then stopped, her voice lowering as she addressed Jonathan directly one more time, stating that she had dedicated years to building operational integrity within the organization and that she deserved a complete review process before any irreversible administrative actions were taken. Jonathan nodded once, acknowledging the statement without reversing the decision, and replied that due process would proceed fully, but that containment of access risk could not wait for emotional or reputational consideration. The distinction between process and privilege was now clearly defined in the room, and everyone present understood it without needing further explanation. Ava shifted slightly closer to Jonathan again, not seeking protection, but alignment, as if instinctively recognizing where stability now resided. Jonathan looked down at her briefly and gave a subtle nod that carried more acknowledgement than words. Victoria remained standing for a moment longer, then slowly released a breath as if accepting that further argument would not change the current state of events. The compliance team member moved closer to her position, not forcefully, but with procedural intent, informing her that she would be escorted to a private review space for formal documentation and response recording. Victoria did not resist, but she did not speak immediately either. Instead, she gave one last glance toward Jonathan, then toward Ava, before turning slightly in the indicated direction. The guests in the ballroom remained silent. No applause, no reaction, only observation as the structure of authority that had defined the evening transitioned into formal procedural enforcement. Jonathan remained in place for a moment after Victoria began to move, then turned slightly toward Ava, and for the first time his expression softened into something less administrative and more human. He asked her quietly if she was all right. Ava hesitated, then nodded, not because everything felt simple, but because she understood that what had just happened was no longer uncertain. It was confirmed. Jonathan looked toward the pill bottle still resting on the table, then back toward the compliance team, and instructed them to secure all physical evidence for external audit continuity. His voice returned to full executive clarity as he issued the instruction, but when he looked back at Ava again, the tone beneath it remained steady and grounded, as if acknowledging that within the structure of systems and verification, there had still been a human moment that initiated everything. The ballroom slowly began to shift again, not into celebration, not into chaos, but into procedural motion, guests guided toward exits, staff quietly coordinating transitions, and systems continuing their silent verification cycles in the background. Ava stood beside Jonathan as the space around them reorganized itself into consequence rather than uncertainty. And for the first time since she had spoken at the beginning of the evening, she was no longer the interruption in the room. She was simply part of the truth that had already been accepted. The ballroom was now in a state of controlled transition, where every movement was guided by procedure rather than emotion, and every conversation had been replaced by structured coordination between compliance teams and executive security staff. Jonathan Pierce stood near the central table where the pill bottle still remained untouched, now marked as secured evidence, his posture steady but no longer passive, as if his role had shifted from participant to overseer of an unfolding verification process that extended beyond the room itself. Ava Williams stood slightly to his right, her presence quiet but no longer uncertain, as she watched the final stages of Victoria Hale being escorted through a side corridor by compliance personnel. Victoria moved without resistance, her expression composed but distant, no longer attempting to engage the room, only focusing forward as the procedural escort guided her out of the ballroom space. The guests remained mostly silent, some already being directed toward exits by staff, others still observing in disbelief as the evening dissolved into formal administrative action. Jonathan's executive assistant approached and confirmed that all pharmaceutical inventory systems had been locked into audit mode and that external regulatory oversight had been notified according to protocol thresholds. Jonathan nodded once, then instructed that all internal communications regarding the incident be consolidated into a single secured report channel to ensure chain of custody integrity. Ava listened without speaking, her eyes following the movement of staff as they secured the remaining materials on the table, including the pill bottle and associated digital logs, everything carefully placed into sealed evidence containers marked for independent review. The atmosphere in the room felt quieter now, not because tension had disappeared, but because resolution had replaced uncertainty. Jonathan finally turned slightly toward Ava and asked her again in a calm voice if she understood what was happening. Ava nodded slowly, then said she understood that the truth had been confirmed, even if she did not understand all the technical parts of how it was confirmed. Jonathan acknowledged her response with a brief, measured expression that softened for a moment before returning to professional composure. He instructed his assistant to ensure that Ava was provided transportation and appropriate care coordination following the incident. But before that could be arranged, Ava looked up at him and quietly asked what would happen next. Jonathan paused, not because he did not know, but because the answer required a shift from systems to people. He explained in simple terms that an independent investigation would continue over the coming days, that all access activity and documentation would be reviewed externally, and that decisions would be made based on verified records rather than assumptions. Ava absorbed this without interruption, then looked down briefly at the polished floor before asking if Victoria would be okay. The question hung in the space for a moment because it did not belong to procedure or protocol. Jonathan considered it carefully, then answered honestly that she would go through the formal process, and that outcomes would depend on findings, but that the system was designed to ensure fairness even when situations were complex. Ava nodded again, accepting the answer in the way children often accept truths they cannot fully categorize yet. As the last of the guests were guided out and the ballroom began to empty into structured silence, Jonathan walked with Ava toward the side exit corridor, not hurried, not escorted, but moving in parallel with the final phase of the evening's closure. Along the way, he briefly looked back at the now cleared central table where only reflections of chandelier light remained. The space that had held tension, uncertainty, and verification now stood empty, as if waiting for the next event that would define it. Ava's small footsteps echoed softly against the marble floor as they moved away from the main hall, and for the first time since she had spoken earlier that evening, there was no attention fixed on her from a crowd, no scrutiny, no doubt, only quiet continuity. Jonathan glanced down at her once more and asked if she needed anything before leaving the building. Ava shook her head slightly, then after a brief pause said she was just tired. Jonathan nodded and adjusted his pace slightly to match hers as they continued through the corridor lined with dimmed lights and closed doors. Behind them, the Sterling Grand Hotel returned gradually to its normal operational rhythm. But within its highest floor, the memory of what had occurred remained embedded in the systems, now actively recording every detail for external review. And as Ava Williams and Jonathan Pierce reached the private elevator leading down from the executive level, the final stage of the night transitioned from public truth to documented reality, closing one sequence while quietly preparing the next phase of consequence and clarity. The elevator doors closed with a soft mechanical whisper that felt unusually final after the chaos and precision of everything that had unfolded above in the executive ballroom. And as the private cabin began its smooth descent from the top floor of the Sterling Grand Hotel, the atmosphere inside shifted into something quieter, almost suspended, as if the weight of the evening had not been left behind, but instead condensed into the small enclosed space where Jonathan Pierce and Ava Williams now stood together. Jonathan remained still, one hand resting lightly near the control panel without pressing anything, his posture no longer carrying the tension of decision-making, but the residual calm of someone who had already crossed the point of no return in a complex verification process. Ava stood slightly to his right, her small hands clasped loosely in front of her, looking up once at the changing floor. Indicator lights before returning her gaze forward. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but layered, filled with the kind of understanding that does not require immediate explanation, only presence. Jonathan finally broke that silence gently by asking if she was all right. Ava nodded after a brief pause, then said she felt okay, but tired in a way that felt deeper than just physical exhaustion. Jonathan acknowledged this quietly and told her she had done something important tonight, not in a way that carried praise or elevation, but in a way that recognized accuracy, consistency, and truth under pressure. Ava looked down slightly at his words, but did not respond immediately, as if processing what importance meant when removed from emotion and placed into structure. The elevator continued downward through several floors, passing dimly lit corridors and closed conference levels that now felt disconnected from what had taken place above. Jonathan's phone vibrated once, and he checked it briefly, receiving a final confirmation from the compliance division that all internal systems had been stabilized, that external regulatory notification had been completed, and that a full, independent audit team would arrive within the next operational cycle to secure and review all related materials. He did not reply, simply turned the screen off and returned it to his pocket. Ava glanced up at him and asked quietly what would happen to the people who were still inside the ballroom. Jonathan considered the question carefully before answering, explaining in simple terms that most would leave as normal guests, while those involved in the process would continue cooperating with formal review procedures, and that everything would be handled through structured investigation rather than immediate assumptions. Ava nodded slowly, absorbing this without further questions. As the elevator descended past the lower executive levels and the lighting shifted from warm gold to cooler neutral tones, Jonathan looked down at her again and asked if she wanted anything before leaving the building. She hesitated briefly, then said she would like to go home. Jonathan responded with a slight nod and confirmed that transportation had already been arranged. As the elevator reached the ground-level lobby, the doors opened to a quieter environment filled with distant city noise and subdued hotel activity. There was no crowd waiting, no attention, only the neutral rhythm of a building returning to normal operations after disruption. Jonathan stepped out first, and Ava followed closely beside him. They walked through the marble lobby in a straight line toward the private exit where a vehicle was already waiting, black, discreet, and stationary near the curb under soft exterior lighting. As they approached, the driver opened the rear door without speaking. Jonathan paused briefly before entering and then turned slightly toward Ava, telling her again that she had handled everything correctly, not as praise, but as acknowledgement of clarity under uncertainty. Ava nodded once and then stepped into the vehicle. Jonathan followed and closed the door gently behind them. Inside the car, the silence was different from the elevator, less enclosed, more open. As the city outside began to move past the tinted windows in soft streaks of light and motion, Ava leaned slightly toward the window, watching the buildings pass in quiet reflection. Jonathan remained still beside her, hands resting calmly, no longer engaged in active systems or decisions, only presence. The vehicle moved smoothly through Manhattan traffic, leaving the hotel behind as the last traces of the evening transitioned from real-time into recorded process and formal review. And in that quiet movement through the city, the night that had begun with uncertainty and warning had fully transformed into documented truth, leaving behind only clarity, consequence, and the silent understanding between a child who spoke first and a man who finally listened.